Hi, everyone. So today we are going to go over the Age of the Enlightenment. These notes are for RLA students and for students who were absent Monday and Tuesday, and for any student that did not get all the information on their guided notes on Monday or Tuesday. So keep in mind, anything that's in bold and black goes into the blank, and anything that's in red is the additional information that you need to add to your notes. So let's look here at the Age of the Enlightenment. Hopefully by now, some of you have watched the Age of the Enlightenment video, and one of the historians in there pointed out that philosophes or philosophers during this time period are a little different than how they were defined, where some had seen them as fools. And yes, philosophes is the French word for philosophers, but see them as that humanist from the Renaissance, because it is that carryover where they are well-rounded individuals and scholars who have studied history, science, math, literature, languages. So they are well-rounded individuals with that liberal arts education. They're also applying this knowledge on how to make the world a better place. And when we look at their core of their philosophical beliefs, there are 5 concepts that we will really see as a component of what they're trying to achieve. All of them are going to try to apply reason to all aspects of life. So let's look here at the core of philosophical beliefs. And I would star these 5 items here because they will show up as a short answer or extended response on next week's assessment. So let's talk about reason. Truth can be discovered through logical thinking. And they keep telling us time and time again, use your brain. And one particular philosopher during his time, Voltaire, will point out in his work Candide that everyone seems to be coming out of the woodwork saying that they're philosophers and they have these theories about how the world functions and how it should function and what we should do within it. And he reminds us some people are really going overboard with their ideas. So in Candide, there is a teacher, a philosopher, who tells us that our noses are on our faces to keep our glasses up. Has nothing to do with breathing whatsoever. And that there were people like Candide, who was a very innocent individual, who believed them. And he says, stop jumping on people's bandwagon. Use your brain. Yes, people present these ideas, but you need to research. You need to discover truth and think things through. Nature, another core of the philosophical beliefs. Natural is good and reasonable. And that the problem that we start to see with nature and the corruption of it is when man comes in and tries to control it. So we'll see how Rousseau is more in tune with nature and the natural goodness of things. Happiness. This is connected to the Renaissance because the humanists had told us that we needed to find joy and happiness here on earth, that we need to find pleasures here in life, that we need to enjoy being alive and celebrating everything that's been created. So we're continuing with that humanistic approach to how we evolve and how we participate in society. Progress. Not only do we see this in the Renaissance, but we see it in the scientific revolution, and we're seeing it in the Enlightenment, and we still see it today in 2020. That society and humankind can be improved upon, that there will be issues that will arise, and we will need to come up with solutions and progress our world. Even though we're not going to look at it at this particular time in our unit, the agricultural revolution is happening at the same time, at the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. There are countries that are dealing with a shortage of food and a population growth, and they need to come up with ways to increase those crop yields. They're going to go to science to find a solution. They're going to find more efficient ways to help with agriculture. And we're going to see how society will progress and then lead us down the path of the Industrial Revolution. And you can look at your technological devices today and thank them for those attempts and for the achievements that they made back then. And then liberty. Now, this one is going to cause a few empires to crumble and a few to rise. And we're going to see changes. New countries will start to emerge and colonies starting to break free and people who are considered outcasts in societies trying to emerge and getting a voice. Liberty, your freedom, where people are going to demand their rights be protected, that they gain certain rights within those countries. At this present time in the Enlightenment, we're looking at people who are saying, hey, I don't want an absolute monarchy. We like what England has with that constitutional. That Bill of Rights they have, that's an amazing document that actually protects people's rights. Well, we're going to see that. But then when we get to the United States, we're going to say, no, we don't want a monarchy. We're going to create something completely different based on these Enlightenment ideals. And then this belief system. We are really seeing that clash between the traditional belief system and this new way of thinking that the scientific revolution was encouraging us to do. Well, the whole tradition of an absolute monarchy, ruling by divine right, that's being thrown out the window. You cannot work with an absolute monarchy who believes that their power comes from a higher being. They are not going to budge. If they believe that what they're doing is right and supported by God, then you're pretty much set in that lifestyle. But one that is limited by law and understanding that their power actually came from the people, now that is someone that the people believe they can work with. They are going to object to the special privileges given to the nobility and the church, the clergy, the Catholic Church. And when we look at some of these special privileges, I use France as an example. So prior to the summer of 1789, France has always been under this old feudal system called the Old Regime, where it, was the structure for their political, their social, and their economic divisions. And society itself was set up in 3 estates. The first estate held the clergy, the church. Second estate was the nobility. And the third estate covered everyone else, whether you were a member of the middle class, the working class, or the peasants. And as a member of the second estate, I would have special privileges. I could tax my people whatever I wanted, the peasants who worked my land. I could charge them for the use of any of the items on my land, even if it was their job. So if you were someone who baked my bread and my pastries and prepared my food, on the day that you weren't working, if you would want to use my ovens, the kitchen, I would then charge you to use them because you're not preparing anything for myself or my family. It was strictly for you, so I'm going to charge you some money. Or if you're someone who built my road and you've done an amazing job, but on your day off, you need to use the road to walk to the current village in order to buy something at the market, I'm going to charge you to walk on the road that you built for me because that's my special privilege. I could also have you thrown into prison because you insulted me or I felt insulted by something you did, because that is my special privilege. And so we will see that the philosophes are going to say, you know what, we need to address this because this is wrong. It's an abuse of power and it is violating people's natural rights. Now, for women, we're going to see that the majority of the philosophes will believe that the Middle Ages got it right when it came to women, that we were corrupt, we were evil, and we were probably on the verge of committing some form of witchcraft somewhere in a village. And that really our traditional role is the best that it should be, that we're wives, we're mothers, or we could become nuns and join a convent. So they're not really seeking any change for women. Although we will see there are some philosophes who will start to push for that change, but the majority will say, no, we got it right in the Middle Ages. The women will remain the property of men with absolutely no rights. Most will turn away from the traditional religious beliefs and say that their faith will be in science, something that they can have that is concrete. They can be provided concrete evidence, which in the scientific revolution, this was what the church was fearing was going to happen. Not only would people walk away from the church, but then deny complete existence of God altogether. And we see that with the atheists. And we also see with the deists that, yes, God created the universe, but God does not interact in our daily lives, which is what the church has been telling us is happening. So for the church, you have some in the church who see this as they are losing power, they're losing influence, and they're losing wealth because people are breaking away. But then you also have some in the church who say, my goodness, we have a large group of people who have lost souls and we need to try to save them. So the church is in a clash with what is going on. The philosophes will reject church rituals, authority of the clergy, so the Pope is not going to have any influence or any of the local priests over what they are doing. And they will be adamant that they will only accept teachings that actually fit with a scientific understanding and that is presented in a logical process, procedures that will be followed, and they have concrete evidence of its truth. So let's look here at some of our philosophes during this time period. Now, there are quite a few, but we're only going to look at maybe 4 or 5. Voltaire. Voltaire, I like to say, has a very loud voice, and it got him in trouble quite a bit. He was imprisoned a couple of times. He was kicked out of France. He was kicked out of Prussia because he definitely liked to point out the flaws in society. And in France, it's illegal to actually speak out against the church, the king, and the aristocracy. And if we look here, he targets all of them. Now, I know one of your homework questions had asked you about essays and novels, and so I'd like to present this to you. Which would you rather prefer reading, a novel or an essay? And most students have said in class that they would prefer a novel. It's entertainment, it's easier to read, it's easier to understand. It can be used as an escape with what's going on in your daily life. But during this time, in countries like France, where you couldn't openly speak out, you could write novels. And for Voltaire, he wrote satires. So let's present real events, but treat them as fiction. Let's not use people's real names. And as people are reading that during this time, they know who and what he's talking about, but he can still say, oh, but it's a work of fiction. I didn't use that person's name. You can't really prove that I'm talking about that particular person in the church or that particular king. But he definitely wanted to address the abuses that's coming from these institutions. He wanted to point out that we needed to have religious tolerance, that we needed to use reason, logical thinking. Stop jumping on every bandwagon that comes around. Although as you read through, let's say Candide, we do discover that Voltaire is human, just like everyone else. And even though he fights for religious freedom, the use of reason, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, he wasn't a very tolerant person. So if you were someone who offended him or upset him, you did become a character in one of his books, and something probably drastic is going to happen to you in that particular book. Like John Locke, Voltaire was a strong supporter of a limited government, which would be England's constitutional monarchy. So keep in mind that at that time, they are seeing the constitutional monarchy of England as the best type of government that will provide that strong government with a monarch, but also one where he is limited by law and allows for participation of a select group of people. Voltaire's ideas you will also find in our Bill of Rights as our First Amendment. So we're really going to see how we here in the United States use these ideas to develop our government and to protect certain rights of our people. Montesquieu, his ideas will be used on how we structure our government. So in Montesquieu's works, he outlines that practices he believes would actually protect our rights, which is what John Locke said we needed to do, that a government's job is to protect our natural rights. And according to Montesquieu, a government that does that would create a good government. It would be a good government. In The Spirit of the Laws, he urges the use of a separation of powers, where we need to have a division. We need different branches. In England, they had that legislature, they had that executive, and we're going to apply the same concept here in our own. So when we look at the Constitution, we will see the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. We not only apply that to the federal, the national level, but it's also at the state level and the local level, because we definitely want to make sure that there is specific powers that lie within those branches and also a checks and balance system so that they can make sure that we reach the goal of setting up our government this way, and that is to prevent any individual or group from gaining total control of the government and abusing their power. Because one of the things that we're going to notice as we progress throughout this year, there are individuals or groups who are trying to eliminate an oppressive government, and they're trying to help the people. But as it's mentioned in our video on the Age of the Enlightenment, sometimes that power they gain starts to corrupt them. And then that corruption flows over into the people, and then their rights start to become abused. So according to Montesquieu, if you set it up so that one group or individual cannot gain all of that power, then they're not going to be able to abuse it. And for him, just like Voltaire and John Locke, England's constitutional monarchy is a great example of a good government. Rousseau is going to take us down a different path. He is not someone who is on board with everything the Enlightenment thinkers are saying. So clearly he's using his own brain, his own thinking process in discovering what the truth is. But he is someone who's going to focus a little bit more on nature and its natural goodness. Because when we look at their scientists in the scientific revolution, they do believe that there are certain laws of nature and how society should function. And Rousseau embraces that in the way society needs to interact with each other. According to Rousseau, civilized society places very heavy expectations upon us. And unfortunately, those expectations has created very unhappy, insecure, and selfish people. So we are not in harmony at all with nature. We are not in harmony with each other. We are pretty much kind of restricted. We are confined, where it's like we have these chains that are binding us to these expectations, and we just don't know how in order to be happy and functioning people in this world. According to him, in his social contract, which is our third social contract we've had in this section, he sees it as an agreement amongst people. So the people will form a government together. He believes a direct democracy, a pure democracy, is the best type of government that we can have. But he also throws in a disclaimer. You can only achieve this if every man is willing to give up his desires and wants for the desires and wants of his fellow man. That you need to put aside your wants and desires for your neighbor, and your neighbor needs to be willing to do the same for you. That if you cannot all be on the same page, then this is not something that you create. Then a pure democracy, it is not going to work. When we look at the delegates from the colonies and their decision to declare independence, to write the Declaration of Independence, and to present it to their people, to present it to the world and to England as a justification for why they need to break away. Those delegates were adamant. We are all in or we are not there. We know there are issues that each colony is having to overcome in order to agree. And we went through a very strategic, logical process to come up with this Declaration of Independence. We also must be on the same page that if at the end of this war, this revolution, because we know it's going to erupt throughout the colonies, that in the end, if we're on the side of victory, that we agree we will create one unified nation, not 13 individual countries. No, we are all in this together or we are not in it at all. So we will see how they will apply this thought process and the procedures in order to move forward. So even though there are many who believe that women should follow a traditional role in society, there were some who stood out and said, absolutely not. There's, inequality here and we need to address it. One of those individuals during the Enlightenment was Mary Wollstonecraft. And in a vindication of the rights of women, she will argue that women need to have more education and that they also need to gain equality in marriage. So if we look at this idea of education, Mary Wollstonecraft will admit that under the current circumstances, men are intellectually superior to women. And that's because of the education that has been provided to the men versus the type of education that's provided to the women. She points out that if men and women receive the same educational opportunities, then women could perform in the same duties and professions as men. So those doors would then need to be open. that would also provide them the same intellectual ability in order to participate politically. That would include being able to vote and being part of the actual governing body. But the key there is you have to provide the same educational opportunity. And then when you address equality in marriage, well, you're looking at a time period that when a man and a woman got married, typically it was some kind of business arrangement between families, and that she would bring in with her a dowry, like land, some wealth, and sometimes it was a mixture of the two. All of that went to her husband. And if he would decide somewhere along the line that he wanted to divorce her, he could. And the money and land that she brought into the marriage remained with him. She received nothing. Or maybe she's in an abusive marriage. She doesn't have the right to actually file for divorce. She can't get out of the marriage. She's stuck. And Mary Wollstonecraft is saying there has to be equality. So if there's a divorce and he is the one wanting the divorce or he is the cause of the divorce, then her land that she brought in and the money will go back to her. And if it's in a situation where she needs to get out of this marriage, then she has the right, should have the right to file for divorce and it be granted. Another way that women were involved in the Enlightenment was holding salons. So education is closed at this time, or at least higher education is closed to women. So the sciences, the arts, the literature, the history, the languages, you're not going to go beyond the little bit that they gave you at a younger age. So for wealthy women, whether they were members of the middle class or the aristocracy, would open up their homes and have salons or just social gatherings, little parties. There's food, there's beverages. You're going to bring, one of the musical composers of the time. So I would have a salon and have Mozart come and play music. The philosophes would be there. If you're in France, and France was the happening place for the Enlightenment, it was the heart of the Enlightenment. You would have people like Voltaire or Montesquieu, Rousseau. You could have Newton. You would have all of these different people from various subject areas coming together, and they were able to actually freely speak their mind. Because it's illegal in France to speak about these things outside of that closed room. They could share their ideas, they could discuss, they could debate. And for women, they were able to participate in this because they're holding it in their houses. And if you were lucky enough to have a father or a brother or an uncle who would use their daughter, their niece, or their sister to help them with their own research or have them become their assistant, then you could display that knowledge and some of the philosophes or scientists would bring you on board as their assistant. Now, your name is not going to be included in the publication of that book. You're not going to get credit, but it did provide you with a way to gain free education and to be able to participate in the Enlightenment. And these salons also help to spread Enlightenment ideas. And the spreading of these ideas is really going to alter what's going on in a lot of these countries. Another area that's going to be touched upon during the Enlightenment is the criminal justice system. And in the video that you are to watch for this week, they talked about how, it was a crazy idea during this time. It was radical that we should use prisons to rehabilitate people, where pretty much they become torture chambers before we have this idea of the Enlightenment and how we need to make changes. And Beccaria, in his works on crimes and punishments, points out that laws exist to preserve social order, not for someone to sit over in a corner and come up with a creative way to torture someone because of a crime that they committed. So they shouldn't be used to avenge crimes. So he is going to fight to bring improvements to the criminal justice system. And what exactly are the reforms that he's going to present? He's going to tell us we need to stop torturing people. We need to abolish torture. And we need to have an end to cruel and unusual punishments. Because you still have countries and authorities who are using methods that were used in the Dark Ages, in the medieval period, where you have someone drinking boiling oil, or you are torturing someone by you're hanging them but not killing them, and you're cutting them down so then you can do other things to them. where maybe you're cutting them open and they have to watch their intestines being pulled out, or you're putting them on the rack and destroying their joints and their bodies. These were methods that were used, and they're continuously using them on people in their communities. And a lot of these torture methods are being used on the commoners. A beheading, getting your head chopped off, those were methods that were used for the aristocracy and the monarchy because they were special and they were above everyone else. That was some of their special privileges that they could receive. But for everyone else, it was methods of torture and destruction. We need to eliminate the excessive fines, and that can also be placing you in prison for 40 years. In France, nobles had the ability to lock someone up for 40 years, or however long they say that they should be, because they insulted them. That if you are accused of a crime, you have rights. You have rights to a speedy trial. You have rights to have a trial by jury. You have the right to know what you're being accused of. In England, under Charles I, before they ended up in their English Civil War, he was so mad that people wouldn't pay his taxes, or Parliament wouldn't force people to pay taxes because they wanted to restrict his power. He would throw people in jail and not tell them what they were being thrown away for. So now they're saying, no, you have the right to know. And if we're going to have a trial by jury, it needs to be a jury of your peers, not mine as a noble person, a member of the aristocracy going after a commoner. It needs to be your peers included in that too. So it will be a fair and just trial. And then an issue that we tend to see still rising up today, and really all of these we tend to see, abolishment of capital punishment, that we need to end the death penalty. And even today we see that states in our own country still have that on the table, and then they have to determine what form of execution are they going to use, and then it bounces over to, are you using cruel and unusual punishment, and is this a form of torture? So when we look at the impact of the Enlightenment, and we're definitely going to see that a lot of these ideas that are being presented, and Immanuel Kant says that, they live in the age of the Enlightenment, but not in an enlightened age, because we will start to see that even though during the Enlightenment, they are talking about all of this stuff and they're writing books about it, and Diderot is going to have an encyclopedia that's going to address social injustices and ways that we can make improvements. We are not seeing people put these ideas into action. The American colonists, we will put these ideas into action, and then we will become the model for other nations to put them into action. So what do we see as the impact? We have confidence that human reason can solve social issues, and it's going to continue. We still have that confidence that we can look at our societal problems and come up with solutions. We are also going to have a more secular outlook, where religion is not going to dictate every single thing that we think and do. So we start to move away from this time period of being superstitious, of being fearful, and being intolerant. We also are going to continue with this idea of the individual and the secular outlook and the importance of the individual. All of that is stemming from humanism in the age of the Renaissance. We're going to continue to grow upon these ideas that people can become important, and that our own ability to judge and reason, not only in our own lives, but in society, it's valuable. We can pat ourselves on the back. We can celebrate our achievements because we are continuing that growth. We will also see that some monarchs are going to embrace Enlightenment thinking, and they start to make some reforms. Now, these enlightened absolute rulers or enlightened despots, they're not going to make any changes that take away their power as king or queen. But even our philosophes believe you needed to have a strong monarchy, but one that embodied the Enlightenment principles. And so they believed that they could strengthen their nation by including these Enlightenment principles and maintaining their full authority as a monarch. So we have three examples. We have Frederick the Great of Prussia, and this land will eventually become a unified German nation. We have Joseph II of Austria, and we have Catherine the Great, also Catherine II of Russia. So with Frederick, we have here, with all three of our individuals in this chart, we have the areas that they made changes that were enlightened, and then we have areas where they showed that, I'm still king or the Tsarina, and I still hold all this power. So education reform, abolishing torture, practicing religious tolerance. Frederick the Great and Voltaire will clash over his limited ability to allow for speech and press, and then that gets Voltaire booted out of Prussia. Joseph here is going to make our most radical changes. He will abolish serfdom. And in Eastern Europe, we still have serfs, which are pretty much peasants who are enslaved to nobles. So they're slaves. They are working the land, and it's pretty much they're stuck in this position for life, and many of them cannot travel from one village to another without permission. In Western Europe, we've already eliminated serfdom. We still have peasants, but they are not enslaved people. Joseph will allow religious freedom, freedom of the press, and he will abolish the death penalty. Unfortunately for Joseph, he makes these changes pretty much all at once, and it was too much too soon, and the people will rise up and rebel. And in the end, a lot of his reforms are going to be removed because his successors are not supportive of these Enlightenment changes. Although he is considered our most enlightened because he makes the most radical changes. Catherine the Great, she had a lot of amazing ideas that she wanted to do for Russia, but she herself became the leader of Russia through the death of her husband and the nobles supporting her and keeping her in place. So the decisions that she makes will need to make the nobles happy in some sense. So there are some limited legal reforms. She does bring education reform and some advancements in medicine. She actually was injected with smallpox, so she took the vaccine, so her people would see that it would be safe enough for them to do the same. But when you look at the changes that they did not make, or some of the things that they did do, increasing their army, I mean, Prussia is going to have the strongest standing army out there. Centralizing their government, which gave them more control, but it also maintained a position for the nobility to still interact. And for Frederick and Catherine, they actually gave their nobles more control over the serfs because they needed to make a compromise. For Frederick, the nobles had to put their sons in his army. They would be officers, but they still had to be part of the army. That allowed them to still have that rigid social structure and maintain control over a group of people. For Catherine, the peasant rebellion in Russia really shook her, and then the French Revolution is just going to devastate her. So a lot of her reforms that she made or wanted to make, she really has to back off of that. So hopefully you're seeing here in our age of the Enlightenment that there are a lot of ideas out there that we today benefit from because we've implemented them in our own country and we cherish them highly. So if you have any questions, email me. And remember that we are wrapping up this unit in our assessment for the scientific revolution, types of governments, and our age of the Enlightenment will fall next week during week 7. Have a good one.